Good afternoon. My name is Mary Ellen Karen, and I'm the CEO of After School Matters, and I'm here to welcome you. I know downtown is not always the desirable place for teachers to go at 4:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, but I wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming here and just tell you a little bit about After School Matters. Just in a show of hands, does anybody know what After School Matters is? Okay, so I don't have to tell you much at all. So After School Matters is a program for high school teens. We work mostly in non-special, what do they call them now? Special enrollment schools? Selective enrollment schools. We work mostly in non-selective enrollment schools. And we provide programming for teenagers in the out-of-school time hours. We have 3 cycles. We have summer, we have fall, and we're about to go into our winter-spring cycle. We have 22,000 teens that we have had through the 3 cycles this year. We'll have about 7,000 teens spread across the city, including in this building, for the winter-spring cycle. And the big thing is we pay teens a stipend. And so we hope that they're able to find things that they're interested in, or maybe things they thought they were interested in but they really hate. So we help them find their path on where they're going during high school and after high school. So we welcome all of you here. I was a teacher and a principal, and I know that schools cannot do everything themselves by themselves, so I'm really happy to be part of After School Matters that supports the CPS goals and the individual schools. We try to work on that every single day to help you do what you do, which is really important work in the schools. So I'm here to welcome all of you, and I'm delighted that Rebecca is here. Our strategy is mostly diverse kind of learning that happens in the After School Matters programs, and teenagers particularly, I'm speaking to the choir, like to feel like they have something to say about what they're doing, and they need. I was also a preschool teacher. I say some of the very things that we say to preschoolers are the same that we should do with adolescents. Give them 3 choices that we like, and all of those other things so that they feel important. So I just want to welcome you and thank you for everything that you do, and we're happy we're partners.
Welcome again, everyone. It's so great to see people that came to the Kenwood event, and it's very exciting to know that the messages that Generation All is starting to share with the city and the ideas that we are generating and will eventually become recommendations for our city are starting to gain some traction. So I'm excited to see all of you, new faces as well, and I just want to thank you, as Mary Ellen said, for coming on a Wednesday afternoon downtown. I know that it's the end of the workday for most of us, or for many of us, so I appreciate that you're all here to participate in this conversation with us. I'm going to go through a couple slides that just talk about what Generational is about, and hopefully just set the stage for today's conversation and for the work that is to come. And please feel free to ask a question along the way. It'll be fairly brief because I really want to jump into the program. So what is Generational? If you visited our website, you've probably seen this statement. If you've talked to others or have gotten the emails that we sent out, we are an initiative at the Chicago Community Trust with funding from the Ford Foundation, but we're a citywide initiative that is focused on uniting Chicagoans from different sectors, different communities, organizations, institutions, around revitalizing neighborhood public high schools. And those words are really important to us because our focus is about the quality, making sure that all neighborhood public high schools are top quality schools so that all students have access to the learning that they need and the experiences both in and out of the school and in and out of the classroom. And we know that that's not just the work of CPS, that's the work of our city. So that's why ASM is one of the partners on our steering committee, as well as people from the city agencies and from community-based organizations, and a host of different groups. But that's what our initiative is about, and we try to do this in a couple of ways, which I'll share. Who's been involved? The Generation All was founded by a core of 3 key partners: the Chicago Community Trust, the Chicago Teachers Union, the Chicago Public Schools, and then Ford as our foundation partner. They funded the program or the initiative. We began meeting with Karen Lewis and Barbara Bennett about a year and a half ago, and really discussing ideas for how we could expand equity in education in Chicago for more students beyond some of the top schools that we already have in our city, but really reaching students in underserved communities and in schools that may be under-resourced, and making sure that there was more access to what they need to develop and thrive across the board. And so through the course of those conversations and work with a few other stakeholders, we really zeroed in on this notion of doing the work in 2 ways. One is with a steering committee and an advisory council that represents the wide range of stakeholders in our city. It includes parents and teachers, students, principals, as well as community-based advocacy organizations, city agencies, and service providers, and research and university partners. That's our steering committee. At the advisory level, we have a mix of the same, but more from a national perspective, and it's a smaller group. Rebecca is one of our advisors and has been really helpful already in giving us resources to use in our planning. And then stakeholders and new partners, I think of all of you as that, because part of our work is reaching out to create this citywide support for revitalizing neighborhood public schools. And that can't be, as I said earlier, the business of just the district or just of our group, but it really will require engaging a wider group of people in that conversation. Our vision, we've workshopped this vision multiple times with our group, and we really finally came to these 3 points. I'm just going to go ahead and read them directly. All students should have access to a top quality education in a neighborhood public high school with the active support of the wider community. So this part of our vision is that our neighborhood public high schools, which are mostly non-selective, should be the place that all students have access to a top quality education if that's where they want to go. They shouldn't be a default option or a place that is the place you go because you didn't get in anywhere else and that you don't want to go to. They really should be places that students can access a top quality education. Our second part of this vision is that all public high school students graduate and are well prepared to become engaged, educated, and capable adults, contributing to the vitality of their families, our communities, our city, and ultimately the world. And that statement really is a lot about when people talk about college and career and life readiness. This is how we're envisioning what we ultimately hope that students who graduate Chicago public high schools will grow into. And then finally, very important for us, is that we envision neighborhoods as being grounded by top quality public schools, schools that become anchors of their communities. We know that that is the case in many communities, and especially in some suburban communities, the high school is, it's a center of a lot of activity, and it's a community anchor. And in our city, there are schools like that as well, and there have been schools like that over the years. But we believe that currently we need to revitalize many of those neighborhood public schools so that they once again become anchors of their communities. That's also an acknowledgement that a school is not, it's not an island, and what we are able to do in schools really depends on the community around it and the community, what they can contribute as well as gain from a strong neighborhood public high school. Our approach is threefold. One is to look at building this broad coalition of organizations and individuals to join in on this work. The second is to provide some seed grants to launch initiative, small projects or collaborative projects that begin to implement some of the recommendations that will come from our group, as well as to look at leveraging and creating new funding. So leveraging existing funding and creating new funding for ultimate implementation. And then the third is something we've added recently, but we really saw this was happening in the work, is that we're creating opportunities for dialogue, resource sharing, and problem solving across communities and in different spaces. And this is the beginning of that, but there will be other opportunities to do that. So as we, as a steering committee, engage a wider group of stakeholders. We also want to always couple the conversations with learning, resource sharing, and problem solving. And there will be multiple ways for doing that over time. This is an important slide. So how long will this take? This isn't a one-year grant. We know that this is a 10-plus year vision, and that people who work on this kind of work, it's transformational and it takes time. And we know we're not the first, but we're bringing a different approach to it, possibly from what others in other cities or here in Chicago have worked on in terms of education. We also know that we need to start with some planning, and so we've built in a year and a half of convenings and planning and learning, so that we're not just jumping in with quick fixes, and that people are being thoughtful in terms of generating ideas and resources, but also looking at research and maybe doing new research to support what we propose. And then we know that the plan ultimately will have maybe 1 to 5 year recommendations, both for policy changes and practice or program changes. But we want to stagger those so that we have a sense of some quick wins, some midterm outcomes, and then some longer term outcomes. And we envision that if this is successful and we're able to begin implementation of the plan, that we would like at about year 3 to revisit that plan and see if it's still viable, it still resonates with our city, and make sure that it still has the legs to become effective. Part of our strategy has been to work very intentionally with the community-based organizations, with educators, with the leadership at CPS, at the teachers union, and also down the line with the mayor's office, whoever that mayor may be, to make sure that when this plan is ready, it isn't just another plan that people will look at and say, oh, these are some good ideas, but that it has support for implementation. So that will be part of, as we engage others, we'll be reaching out to all of you for that. And how do you get involved? So a few ideas. We have in your folders materials for today's workshop, but there's also a Get Involved card, which I invite you to fill out so that we can add you to our list and make sure to stay in touch with you. We will have eventually some work groups that will engage a broader audience in giving us ideas and input on the proposals that are coming out from our steering committee. And at that point, that will go out into multiple communities, a wide range of stakeholders, and so that's another way for you to get involved. You have a chance to comment on that on the Get Involved card. We also would love for you to engage in social media with us and tell people about Generational through Twitter and Facebook and on our website.
So when I first learned about this effort to revitalize neighborhood high schools, I thought, oh, well, that's my work. So I'm the principal at Washington High School. I'm not sure if you know where it is. It's very far southeast. It's in between the Skyway and 94. And ever since we've received the data on who goes to what school, where they live, we've been promoting the fact that we're the most neighborhood of all neighborhood high schools in the city of Chicago. We have more kids from our attendance area who go to our school than any school in the city of Chicago. And of the kids who live in our attendance boundary, it's like 2,400 kids who go to public school, more kids go to our school than any other attendance boundary school. However, when we saw that data, we also learned that 35% of the kids who live in the attendance boundaries do not. And so, because the vision of our school is to really be the premier school in the neighborhoods that everyone wants to go there, part of our work is to close that gap. And so it was really useful to get that data, and I think that came from the great writers at Catalyst, so we appreciate that. And so thankful to be here at After School Matters, and it's just a reminder that this idea of student-centered learning, critical. Because I walk in here, and I'm talking to Dr. Wolfe, and I look over her shoulder, and I see a piece of artwork on the wall, and I'm like, I know that's Leonella's artwork. I recognize the boys in the picture. And so one of my students' artwork is on the wall. It's just a reminder that there are limits to the traditional setup of schools. And so when we have these nice relationships, like an After School Matters opportunity, even when I was a teacher at Sen, I had some kids who participated in in Gallery 37 in the afternoon, and as a teacher, you don't even you're not familiar with these programs until your student educates you about them. And even Leonella, I don't really know she's doing this until my art teacher tells me. So just a reminder that we do need to have some flexibility in our learning systems. And so with that said, it'd be my pleasure to try to briefly introduce Dr. Wolfe as our generational speaker tonight. And then again, thank Beatrice for inviting me here and for convening the group. I think it's a critical group. And I think when I was a teacher years ago, I didn't have the patience for grassroots movement. And now, being a principal, I know that it's the only way to go. So Dr. Wolfe currently directs Students at the Center, which is a Jobs for the Future initiative that aims to strengthen the ability of practitioners and policymakers to engage each student in acquiring the skills, knowledge, and expertise needed to succeed in college, career, and civic life. She explained this to me as like she is a translator of research. Huge body of research out there, like let's say on learning theory. What does it mean for practitioners? Not a whole lot if it's not accessible. So part of her work is bringing the research to the people, kind of like the Enlightenment movement, right? Dr. Wolfe, let's see, prior to Jobs for the Future, she was the program director at the Fairfield County Community Foundation, which developed a cross-district school leadership initiative for growing and training urban school principals, something that's close to my heart. She has worked as a middle school site coordinator for Gear Up, as a teacher at several college readiness initiatives for low-income middle school children in Boston and other East Coast areas. Dr. Wolfe holds a BA in sociology with a focus on urban education from Harvard and a PhD in education policy administration from Stanford. Dr. Wolfe has authored and co-authored numerous publications, including the one I read in preparation for today, which you can find on the Jobs for the Future website, which is this, Past and Promise, Today's Competency Education Movement. She's also the author of another recent book that came out, published by Harvard, that includes even some Chicago area researchers. In the introduction to this paper that I read of hers, she describes the emergence of the modern American high school as among the most remarkable accomplishments in U.S. history. And then she goes on to write, now, more than a century later, as we grapple with the greatest challenge of our current era, preparing all students from all backgrounds for college and careers, many people are taking a hard look at our 100-year-old assumptions about the best ways to organize K-12 education, particularly at the high school level. And I tell you, being in a neighborhood high school in a former steelworker area, it's taken my neighborhood a little while to adjust to this, because really, when we were graduating, 40 or 50% of the kids at Washington 20 years ago, it was just fine. Those kids were leaving, and they were getting really good union-paying jobs. It wasn't critical that they go on to college. And so my neighborhood, it's been a little bit hard for us to adjust to the new economy, but we are making strides. So that's my little piece too. In Chicago, everyone is working on it. Students, parents, teachers, principals, district leaders, policymakers, we're all grappling with this challenge of the new demands of education today. And many of us are committed to the role that neighborhood high schools play in this. And it's also true that many stakeholders believe that we need to make changes, especially when we think about the critical role that neighborhood high schools play in fulfilling this dream, because obviously there's a gap between fulfilling it right now and the vision. Well, we shouldn't be surprised that Dr. Wolfe is not going to offer any silver bullet solutions here. And unfortunately, this is what the education community loves, right? We love the idea of like a quick fix, get every kid a computer, or buy this program in, or change teachers. All of these are well-intentioned and probably together are very meaningful reforms, but I don't think that's what Dr. Wolfe is going to be talking about today. In fact, my guess is, and based on the little bit of reading that I've done based on her ideas, is that she's going to start to challenge the deep culture, the assumptions, the current practices around how high schools work in a way that both makes sense but also is challenging for people like me, because she's going to suggest some things in a few minutes that are difficult. And let me give you just a little example. One thing Dr. Wolfe brings up in some of her writings is this idea that maybe we need to personalize learning a little bit more. Maybe we need to provide students with the opportunity for mastery at their own pace. At their own pace is kind of challenging. So is everyone at their own pace, because at high school, each teacher has 130 students, right? They have them in 5 classes, but 130 students. How do you personalize learning for that many kids? It's a real challenge. So, even think back to your educational experience. To what extent was it personalized? Probably not so much. We all grew up in this environment where we were given A, B, C, D, E, F, not E. And we were it's also a credit-based system, right? You graduate based on credits that you earn. And Melissa Roderick and our group over here from University of Chicago, we've done a lot to try to work within the current constraints, to try to let things like credits drive our work in terms of providing additional supports for kids. But I think Dr. Wolfe is actually going to encourage us to just rethink everything we're doing, which I think is a good idea. If we're a profession, that's what we need to continually do. So without further comment, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Wolfe.
That was great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Principal Gaelic. And there's nothing a working room of teachers at the end of the day like to hear more than I'm going to ask you to rethink absolutely everything you're doing and do it all differently. So that's a great setup. I really appreciate that. But that is a fair amount of what I'm going to do. So I don't know if you saw this was in the program, but I want to actually just take the first 2 minutes before I get going and let you get going a little bit. So please turn to somebody who you don't know at the table. Introduce yourself, tell them where you're from. And just quickly, one experience that you can recall, the first thing that pops to mind that to you felt student-centered as an experience, and why do you think that was student-centered? So please go. Wrap up your stories, please. And if you can hear the sound of my voice, please raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can hear the sound of my voice, please raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can hear the sound of my voice, please raise your hand and close your mouth. Thank you very much. Works in middle school cafeterias, works in any crowd of adults. So again, good evening, everybody. I'm Rebecca Wolfe, and despite that beautiful introduction, the only person in my family who's ever been known as Dr. Wolfe is my father, who was a surgeon. So I tend to go by Rebecca, and that would be fine here as well, so thank you. So you heard a little bit from the bio about what Jobs for the Future is and what we do and what Students at the Center is, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about why it matters for this conversation. So Jobs for the Future is a national organization based in Boston. We work across what we call the education through post-secondary through workforce pipelines, with a specific aim of trying to ensure that all low-income people have some kind of post-secondary education and credential so that they can earn a family-sustaining wage. And the reason I tell you that harkens in part to what the story, may I call you Kevin? So instead of principal. So what Kevin was telling you about the changes of what he saw in his school. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but Jobs for the Future does research, advocacy, and hands-on technical assistance in states, communities all across the country. And there is no longer any question that you absolutely have to have some kind of post-secondary credential to be able to earn that family-sustaining wage, no matter who you are and no matter where you come from, because of how the economy has shifted, the global economy, and what skills you need. So what that means is that we need to be preparing a very different kind of student. Students at the Center has tried to do that by playing this role that we didn't invent but embrace called a research intermediary. So we do not do research ourselves, but we try to work with the best researchers out there who are learning the best that they can about how we learn, what motivates students, what makes them tick, and therefore what does that mean for what we do in schools and what we do in policy and what we do in communities. So that's a little bit about us. But the reason I'm here to talk to you today is about what was come out of that 4.5 years of research. and start working with, again, some of the best minds across the country in all sorts of different disciplines who have been trying to get us to understand, us being those who are working in the field, because that's primarily where Jobs for the Future works, and that's primarily where our partners work, to understand what do we know. And so what has come out of that at 4.5 years is originally white papers. But we all know nobody has time who's working in schools, who's working in policy, who's working in states to sit down and read a 30-page paper, and as Principal Ken said, and then know what to do about it. So we try to work in that intersection of what to do about it, and one of the first things is to understand what is the it. So when we started looking into it, we saw that there's this great journal out there that was kind of fun because it turns out that it is from the University of Chicago. I'm wondering if you can hear me if I stay away from the mic. I'm looking at the folks in the back. Can you still hear? And don't be shy if you'd rather use the mic, because I find it hard to stand still at a podium. So, and is this okay with you? Okay. So what this showed us from the School Review Journal that came out of the University of Chicago is that if you look across all of this research, that again, we've been doing this for at least 4.5 years, but the research has been around for quite some time, and we tried to compile it, and we tried to say, well, what is this telling us? And what we see is that there are these trends. So we have gone from curriculum in schools being what was really subject matter centered. So, most of our work is in high schools, and high schools are really organized around the subject. So we went from everything needs to be organized around the subject and the content. Then it became teacher-centered. So what do teachers do? How do teachers teach? How do they stand in front of the classroom and lecture, as I'm doing right now, and what's the best way to do that? And then we've started moving to this philosophy of student-centered. Well, this would all be a pretty decent summary of kind of what we've gone through if this was about 100 years ago. So that's supposed to say 1938. So that journal went out of business about 75 years ago. So I put this up there because this is not new, and we fully acknowledge that. One of the things that we actually feel we bring to this, we being the students at the center work and the other partners out there and the academics who are trying to think about this, is that we are building on a very substantial amount of knowledge about what really it takes for students to get to that college and career readiness. So what is new today? Why are we bothering to talk about these trends that were trends back in 1938? So the first thing, and you've now heard me say a couple of different times, we actually have greatly more information about everything from literally to how the brain works. What happens in the brain that fires when a student is learning, all the way through much more about, well, what does that then mean in the classroom? What actually motivates them? This is not to say we have all the answers. I wish we did. We have some very wonderful people, some of whom are in this room, who are working on really pulling apart what does this mean and what do the frameworks look like. We haven't figured it all out, but we know an awful lot more than we did, certainly in the 30s and certainly than we did in some of the previous movements that looked a lot like student-centered. So project-based learning, performance assessment, all of these great things that have been around for a long time. We actually know a lot more about what really works in the learning with them. New technologies. This is not to say, I love the example that give everybody a laptop and we've solved the problems of education. But what that means is that when we're talking about things like personalization that are massive, when you start thinking about it, when you have one teacher times, I think actually 135 is pretty decent from some of the schools that we've looked at and worked at, one teacher per 135 students. When you start thinking about personalization for that, this was never before doable at scale without the kinds of technology that we have today. And again, yes, I'm not the easy answer lady. So we have not figured out the perfect systems for all of this, but there are far better systems out there, and there are districts that are using them, and there are schools that are using technology that's enabling this kind of personalization. at a far larger scale. New economic realities, you heard me mention that. Again, you read the headlines all the time. One statistic I find particularly striking in our work, again, that JFF works with lower income, underserved learners, and we have looked at post-secondary success rates. 21% of low-income people anywhere have a post-secondary credential of any kind. So that's of people that enter post-secondary, have made it through high school, have graduated with enough of a credential that they can enter post-secondary, only 21% of them ever come out with any kind of credential. And what we know is that that leaves millions and millions of people not able to earn the kind of wages they need to support their families. And again, I'm not going to go on, but we all know what that means, I think, at this point about lost wages, lost taxes, judicial system issues, generational poverty. So it is no longer okay that we just get our students a high school degree, and even that is a huge lift. So we need to be thinking pretty differently about what we're going to do. Political will and momentum. Love or hate the Common Core, it is here. Whether or not you're in a Common Core state, and I know, at least for the moment, Illinois is, even non-Common Core states, the conversation is now about what are those rigorous skills that you actually need. This is a very different moment than we've been. This is a time when we are having a conversation as a country in a way we never have, at least in the 20 years I've been in education, about what do skills actually look like that we need to succeed in this new economic reality. We've heard President Obama talking about community college for all. There's the Young Men of Color initiative sweeping. There is a whole other group of folks working on something called deeper learning, which I'll talk a little bit more about. There is momentum around really thinking differently in a way that we have never had in a long time in education reform, and we have never had in this idea of for all students. We have had lots of waves of reform. This is really the first time we were thinking about what do all students need to know and to be able to do to succeed, and much more clarity as to what's meant about student-centered. At least I hope you will think that after I am done. I want to say one more thing about the clarity, which is that I'm going to do my best to give you a framework, and I'm going to say that this is a very top-level framework with a lot beneath it. So I hope we'll have some time in the Q&A to go a little bit deeper into that. But you will see that when I say clarity, there are just tons and tons and tons of things behind this. So what we've tried to do is say there are all these terms and things swimming out there. Student-centered is not new, so how the heck do we make sense of all of this stuff that's out there? And so you have in your packets our kind of formal definition and the diagram I'm about to show you. What I want to do is, instead of reading that, I want to give you a sense of questions, a set of questions that when you are thinking about something you're doing in your classroom, when you're thinking about your neighborhood school or another school, when you're thinking about your own practice, these are a set of questions you would want to be asking yourself to understand, is what we're doing really getting at being student-centered or not? And again, this came out of this 4.5 years of really trying to look across a vast number of research on motivation, learning, engagement. So first, is it personalized? So you've heard me say that term a couple of times. That is definitely one of those terms that's out there that is used ad nauseum. What we mean when we say it is, does it take first and foremost individual students' needs, interests, and passions, and does it then figure out how that student learns best and how to merge that with the relationships of other students and with adults in the building? So often personalized has come to mean sit them in front of a computer that does adaptive testing and give them a long list of multiple choice questions, and then the next day it spits out a curriculum for them. When we talk about it and when we talk about what we know about really what works for students, yes, it's individually what they need, but it's also about those relationships. Competency-based learning. So it's called different things in different places. We go with the term competency-based because that's what's in federal statute. This is really just the notion of do we take those big standards of what students need to know and do we break them down into smaller pieces so that when a student is ready, do we know they're ready, and do we know that through multiple ways of assessing they're ready, and do we know that once we know they're ready, they have some kind of opportunity to move to something next, to deepen their learning, to accelerate their learning, to stretch their learning. And if we're finding they're not ready, are we teaching it and doing it in a different way? The example I like to use of this is an algebra class. So an algebra class in and of itself is already competency-based because you have certain things you have to learn to graduate from that class. You have certain points, there are certain concepts, you've got to know certain things like number lines, all of those things are very based on certain competencies. But you could get through an entire year of algebra and fail it. And in most schools around the country, if you failed that class, you start right back at the beginning learning them all, even if you already can do basic quadratics. You can already do number line. So even though it's all about the competencies along the way, the difference is can you actually have a chance to do it at a different pace and a different time. Anytime, anywhere learning, speaking of anytime. So this is the perfect place to be talking about this one, After School Matters. It's not just about, so I have a question. How many people here around 2:30 or so, after the lunch dip, does your brain just turn off and you're done for the day? Is that it? Everybody's done? You're really done? Okay, and how many people, once you're done for the day, maybe around 8 p.m. or so, you get your second wind after dinner, the kids are in bed, at least in my case, and maybe you're ready for another hour or so, or something like that. So some of you. And how many of you, when you wake up in the morning, once you've had that cup of coffee, you are just zooming, you are ready to go? So we've got some morning birds. So not one of you raised your hand for all three of these. So real simple way of saying our brains don't just turn on at 8 in the morning and off at 8:30 in the afternoon because that's what the time of school is. So part of Anytime, Anywhere learning is figuring out how to keep those brains firing up at all different times of the day and when works for different students. So time is a really critical piece of trying to be more student-centered. The other thing is taking advantage of the digital world and the world beyond the school and all of the learning that happens there in the community, which is one of the things that seems so exciting about part of what Generational is about, and within the building itself. So how many high schools are developed by department, and the history department certainly never talks to the science department, and heaven forbid the math department ever talks to the English department. There is much learning that is lost because we set up those false walls. And the fourth piece, student-owned learning. This is the part that is possibly newest, possibly scariest for some of us traditional teachers, but is also the part that is probably most important and that often gets left out. So what we have found over and over and over again in the research is that if students don't have some kind of voice in how they learn, if they don't have ownership, if they don't understand why they're on the learning trajectory they're learning, they are never going to get to the learning point that they could if they're learning at all. So I want to say that a slightly different way. These kind of things around whether a student understands their own learning path and has some choice in it aren't these nice things that After School Matters is going to take care of because that's when they get to choose whether they do art or drama. They aren't these nice little things that if they finished all their other assignments, maybe we'll let them choose a book. Because all that other stuff that you have to get through, they're actually not learning at the depth they could, and possibly not at all, if they are not engaging their brains in that way of having ownership and choice. So those are the four things that we consider when we say student-centered. So when you see the term floating out there, I would hope you start asking your questions of, is it giving these opportunities? But we didn't stop there because, as if this wasn't big enough and complicated enough, we've started talking about how these things are going to get you, as I started, to that knowledge, skills, and dispositions to succeed. Because it's all well and good if you do all four of those student-centered things, you can have an incredibly vital, vibrant, exciting basket weaving class that really is going to speak to this one student who has all her life wanted to do basket weaving and then has no idea what to do with it next. And there's no college program in the world that takes basket weaving, and that's all she's learned. But gosh darn it, you have been so student-centered because that's what she was really passionate about. That's nice, but we are saying that's not enough. Because again, as I started out saying, this is really about that kind of education that's going to get all students to succeed. So knowledge, skills, and dispositions. For us, we use the shorthand deeper learning. This is the idea that throughout all of the 4 principles, personalized, competency, anytime, anywhere, student-owned, that you're never going to get to those ideal outcomes if you're not doing them all in a way that keeps an eye on deeper learning. So I'm going to say one more second about the deeper learning piece and what that means. But I want to just pause for a sec and just say that we know every time we put this out, it looks huge and daunting and possibly extremely different than what you're seeing every day in your schools. And so one of the things that I want to talk more about, and I'm hoping that you'll take away from some of this, is that this is ideal. This is based on, again, research as well as work with communities and schools and districts and states that are trying this and are stumbling through it and are struggling through it. There are very few places today where you can see all of this happening. The importance of this framework is having that North Star, is having that thing that you are working with your staff, with your fellow teachers, with your parents, with your students to say, I can describe what we're heading towards, and we're going to do a piece of it this year. We're going to do a piece of it this month. But this is where we're going. Even if you're not seeing all of it now, this is what we need to be moving towards with our schools. So it is aspirational, but you can also see this happening already in just about every school anywhere in the country. You can find pieces of this. The other part is that these 4 things together have an amplifying effect. So pieces are great and pieces are inspiring, but it's not until we have all 4 of these intertwined that we're really going to get that ramp up in learning and teaching and the outcomes. So deeper learning has been defined by the Hewlett Foundation, which is a big part of our work, to have these 6 elements to it. They're on your sheet, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I just, again, want to point out that one of the questions I get a lot in these is student-centered and is deeper learning, is it the same as Common Core? Is it part of Common Core? How does it all fit? Is it something we're doing in addition to Common Core? You've got a little FAQ thing in there where we try to tackle that a little bit. So the answer is yes, no, and maybe. So not super satisfying, but the very first part of anything we do in deeper learning, any of these outcomes, has to be about mastering core competencies. So the Common Core does help us at least spell out what those competencies might look like. How we get to those core competencies, that's where the real student-centered part comes in. It can be student-centered and it can't be. We've seen some horrible rollouts of Common Core and we've seen some incredibly thoughtful rollouts. So it's not an either or. So the second piece of deeper learning is thinking critically and solving complex problems. So yes, again, some of that is tackled by Common Core, not at quite the depth that we would want. And the 3 last things are really above and beyond. So working collaboratively, communicating effectively, which means both in writing and in literature, and learning how to learn. So all of these things bundled together are, again, coming out of some really terrific synthesis work across, frankly, hundreds of years of research and thinking about how the brain works, how learning works, and what it's going to take to get to those knowledge, skills, and dispositions. So, oops, sorry, I'm developing academic mindsets. So, how am I doing on time?
We have about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes, all right. So, So I'm just trying to think, because there was a story that I wanted to share with you, but I think the videos will do a better example of it. So what about all these other terms? So you hear all this stuff out here. For those of you who can't see in the back, exhibitions, you heard me mention project-based learning, you heard me talk about internships maybe, out-of-school learning, all this other great stuff that has been called student-centered, that is student-centered. How do you parse all that? Where does that all go? So these are all great, what we call tools in service of. So again, just because you're doing one-to-one computing, you could be student-centered and you could not be. It's really about whether you're using it in service of the larger vision. So that's another thing to be asking yourself when you're thinking about, well, my school is getting really into portfolios at the end of the year, so we must be student-centered. Maybe. That's a great step in the right direction if it's being done thoughtfully, if it's being done in a way that's actually thinking about the culture of the school and how the students get to decide those portfolios and who's assessing them and whether they're rigorous. And there's a lot of pieces under that. So I want to give you one sort of real life example of a place that has been doing some of this. And all of these links are available, will be available right on the website. So again, for the sake of time, I don't want to go through all of them. But I want to show, actually, I think the one in the middle. So this school is a magnet, what you're going to see is a news broadcast of a magnet school in New Haven that works very much like the neighborhood schools here, in that although it has a theme to it, it's open enrollment and it's largely students from the New Haven neighborhood. And they have been trying to move towards more of a competency base. So I just wanted you to see a little bit of kind of what it looks like. So with this.
The principal, the administrator, is called the building leader, elected by the teachers.
So that's far from the only unusual feature of the school. Here's Brad Drayson with our Making the Grade report.
Everybody.
At first glance, this may seem like just another high school classroom. But take a closer look.
What's your ultimate goal in terms of the material that you need to learn?
New Haven's high school in the community is an old school with a new approach called mastery-based learning.
Not how much time have you spent, not how much have you grown from day one of the school year to day 180 of the school year, but did you accomplish a set of work that demonstrates that you're ready to move on?
Building leader Eric Good says the rules for students here are simple. Move at your own pace, and when you've mastered a topic, you progress to the next level. For some students, like Courtney Stanton, the transition to the mastery model has been challenging.
Getting on my own pace was hard. Like, I'm used to everybody doing one thing in the whole class. Everybody gets handouts.
But you won't find 32 copies of the same assignment here.
It takes more planning, it takes more preparation up front. I think the school, more than anything else, has always been about not assuming that the way that education worked before is the way that it needs to continue to work.
In this world history class, some kids are working on memorizing the continents, while others can point out dozens of countries on a map.
I'm going to check in 20 minutes to see how far we are with our goals.
The one constant is goal setting. Every day, students come in with an idea of what they want to accomplish. The tasks may be different, but the aim is the same. Prove you're capable to move on.
You want to do it more when you set it yourself.
I could see that the places that I really didn't score that well on, that I could just keep trying so it sticks to my head.
The mastery-based model is only in its second year. Students and teachers are already confident they're heading in the right direction.
There's no doubt that the instruction has changed in ways that I think are going to start driving student results as well.
Brad Drayson, NBC Connecticut.
So one of the reasons I like this video is
the remnants of the old Palace and Roger Sherman Theater can be seen as you look at this.
then there's an ad afterwards, is that I actually think they hint quite broadly at the difficulties of doing this work. And I've been in that school, and I can tell you how much they are still struggling with it. And I can also tell you how completely committed the teachers are and the student support folks are to making it work. And they are about into year 3 at this point. And I would say that it probably is going to take them at least another 2 years to start ironing out the kinks. But they've actually had lower teacher turnover this year than they've had ever before. So despite it being harder, it's just one example of the places that we've heard over and over again that it's actually enabling teachers to do what they thought they got into the teacher profession in the first place to do, which is to really think about how do they ensure their students are learning. And so when they start focusing on that learning first and foremost, it gives a lot of power to the teachers, as well as when you hear me talking about student voice and student empowerment. Most of these models, again, are very challenging, and they call into question a lot of the original cultures of the building, where you go into your room and you shut your door and you do your thing and that's that. And occasionally your principal comes in for 10 minutes and you pretend at that point that you were doing something really engaging, and then you hope that he or she leaves. This is a very, very different way of thinking about what goes on in a school building, even within existing time pressures, even within existing testing pressures. So one of the things that I've had a chance to do in this work is to visit schools. And I try to do that all over the country, because everywhere in the country there are different political challenges, and there are different strictures of what you can and cannot do in time, and what you can and cannot do in teacher evaluation, and what you can and cannot do in Common Core. And so I was able to visit a school not long ago in a Midwestern state that was not here, but nearby. And I went to a comprehensive high school. So that is to say, the district high school. Not a special school, not a small school, not an interactive, not a charter school. Let's call it John Dewey High School. So I was in John Dewey High School, and I got a chance to hang out in a physics classroom. And this classroom was unlike probably anything that any of us went to school in, and certainly the way most schools look today. So you walk into the room, and it looks something like this. It's big, it's open, and instead of chairs, there are these tables there that are sort of waist high. And students are grouped around them in groups of 3 and 4, and they're all kind of head down, bent over this electricity exercise, where they're building breadboards, and they're wiring things, and if they wire them correctly, a little light bulb goes off. So how's that for a metaphor? So I'm circling around the room, and next to each student is a worksheet where they've clearly done the pre-work of thinking about what is the lesson, what do they need to be, what are the physics equations that are behind the electrical work, what are some of their inquiry questions. So each student individually had planned what they're going to do before they got to this table, and yet here they are in these groups working together. And very quickly, as I circulated, you can tell, and some of it I cheated, I asked, it's multi-grade, so we had everything from 9th to 12th graders in this classroom, and very clearly different learning abilities. I mean, there were some kids that spoke far more eloquently about physics, certainly, than I ever could, because I was actually not very good at physics, so that's not a great example. But we're teaching other students. We're clearly, almost working as teachers' helpers. And then there were some students that you could just look at their papers and see that there was something going on where they needed some extra help. And the teacher was there, and he's circulating, and he clearly has this great rapport with them, because there's this wonderful buzz in the room where it's certainly not quiet, but it's not out of control, and you can tell that for the most part, everyone's really just focused, and they're in this experiment, and they're really on it. And then I look, and there's a doorway attached to the classroom, kind of on the other side. And standing in the doorway is this little girl. I mean, I can't, I'd like to respectfully call her a woman, but she was a little girl. She was this tiny little thing. And she was just sort of standing there, and I went over and I said to her, "So is this your classroom? How come you're not at one of these tables?" And she says, "No, that's not my class. I'm in credit recovery." And she points behind her, and there's what looks like a janitor's closet. No windows, nothing on the walls. There's some tables that I think might have escaped from the cafeteria. There's a couple of computers that, without telling you how old I am, quite honestly, one of the monitors was the monitor I was using in college, which is to say a really long time ago. And I said, so what's going on in here? Well, and no teacher in sight, just computers, really old, mismatched computers. And I said, what's going on? Why are you in credit recovery? And she sort of points at herself, and I look down, and she's about 4 months pregnant. She said, well, I was homeschooled for a while because I had some difficulty my first couple of months, and I'm about to go on home leave, so I'm doing homework. And that to me was that moment that, at least because of the work that I've done for so many years in working with kids in alternative settings, just makes me want to cry. Because you went from that high of the classroom truly of the future, the classroom that looks like the room we all wish we had gone to school with, the classroom that would have kept me in the physics room, to the janitor's closet. And that, to me, is what's missing right now, in the fact that we have all these student-centered systems, we have a lot that we know about, but we have not cracked that nut of how we are going to ensure that all students, regardless of their situation, regardless of what they've done, have that opportunity at some point in their career to be engaged, to have that kind of buzz in the room, that hands-on work that I saw in that other classroom. So that's when we get to the thorny implementation questions of how the heck do you actually do this? So what does it take to implement this framework? That's something that we are working on in real time. It's something we're studying in districts and states that are trying to do this. It's something that doesn't look pretty. This is what we call the ecosystem. This is really another way of looking at Generation All. So we've put learners in the center. Unfortunately, because of the darkness, you can't quite see, but what we've done is we've taken the 4 elements of being student-centered, the deeper learning, and we've said that we have roles and responsibilities, all of us, across each one of those in internested circles if we're going to do this. This is not about teacher changing. This is not about let's change the curriculum. This is actually about deep cultural transformation and what we think about schools. And what that looks like is that. It's just a few of the things that we might have to actually think about changing. So before you go kicking me out of the city, what we have started finding when we look at how do you actually start doing this is that there's no one right answer. And in some ways that's scary, and in some ways that's really good news. Because this is not a model. I'm not telling you about some package that in a couple years we're going to have in a nice little formula that you can, as we said, there's no silver bullet. I mean, this is really about deeply rethinking how we do school. But what we have seen in the districts and the schools and the states that have started doing this and that are setting success with it is that what they've done is they've picked one entry point. They've picked one thing to start with among all of these things, and they have said, that's where we're going to start. And that, again, is the good news for what Generation All is doing, is you've said, we are going to look at neighborhood schools. We're not looking at the whole city. We're not reinventing the whole system. We are going to see what can we do with neighborhood schools that will get them to be the kinds of places that we're talking about that are student-centered, that get us to those deeper learning outcomes. And we're going to start slow, and we're going to know that this is going to take a long time. The other piece that so far I've seen Generation All doing a really good job of, and you're all part of that, is communication. So every district that I've talked to and I've interviewed and I've said, where have you started? What was successful? They said, it's the old, go slow to go fast. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Spend a really long time having these conversations about, here's this whole big crazy framework. What does it mean to you? What's it going to take to get there? What's your particular role in getting there? What can you do tomorrow to start us on the path, even though we know it's going to take a long time to get there? So a few things, and then I'm just going to wrap up. So a few things just so you know that we're trying to do to support efforts to get there. So in addition to all the white papers and the reports, I kept sort of waving my hands and saying, we have research, we have research. I encourage you to go on our website and check out the research. So again, tonight I can't quite get into the depths of that, but on studentsatthecenter.org, all of our white papers are free. We are in the midst of releasing a series of new papers that focus not on the student-centered piece, but on that deeper learning piece, and picking those apart. And then we then take those So the topics, so where it says studentsathecenter.org/topics, that's where you will find the white papers, but then we don't stop there because again, we know that that's really hard. Even if you're engaged in the paper, even if you love it, knowing what to do next is difficult. So every month we put out a newsletter, which you can subscribe to. It's a roundup of all the things, so not just the research, but who's talking about it out there in the country, who's doing it, where are the webinars, where are the other tools, what are the resources out there, and every time we release a new tool or resource, it's on our newsletter, so I encourage you to think about joining that. And then we're very excited that in next month, if all goes well, we're going to be releasing a new version of our website, so you can still go to the same website, but it's going to be a much more public-facing website, and by which I mean the original one was really all geared around the research. This is really geared much around movement building. It's being funded by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, which is New England-based, and they have really helped create this New England lab. It's not a thing, it's that the entire area of New England is doing a lot of this work. And so on that website, you'll be able to find who's doing what where. There's an interactive map. You'll be able to find events. Eventually, we hope that it has more of a national focus. You'll be able to find tools, resources, by which I mean rubrics. What does Pittsfield High School use as they've moved towards a competency-based model? How do they ensure that they still have rigor in their classroom? Examples of their rubrics will be up there. All sorts of different things to unpack that the sort of, I call it the Girl Scout diagram of our framework. So all sorts of different things to understand how might you talk with your staff, with your peers, with other students about what this means and what it would look like. And concluding thoughts, so change is coming. You've heard me talk a lot about this. So I'm usually not a betting woman. I'm betting that NCLB or early ESEA is actually going to be reauthorized this time. We have running house bets at JFF. Several of us lost that one 3 years ago. It's going to happen. So that is going to change. We have the new assessments on the Common Core coming. As we've talked about technology, I've already talked about the global. So we can't hide under the rock of how we used to do school. It's not going to work anymore. Whether it means how you're being evaluated as a teacher is going to change, whether it means what your students need to do is going to change, how you communicate with parents, it is changing. So that is being coupled with the fact that it is happening and it is possible. So you saw one very small snippet. There's a couple other snippets in the slides of what it looks like. A couple just more examples of where some of this work is actually taking place. There's a terrific study that came out not long ago from AIR, the American Institute of Research, that profiled what they call deeper learning schools. So these are charter schools for the most part, but they also include regular district schools. And what it showed is that in schools that have put this focus on deeper learning, they're getting better outcomes in attendance, graduation, and college going and college persistence rates. So not just we're talking about it in theory, but we're seeing this actually happening and having an impact in, I think there's something like 500, I'm looking at Camille, about 500 of the deeper learning schools. Early college and STEM schools. This has been a big part of the work that my organization, Jobs for the Future, has been part of. There's a lot of work across the country. We just had our recent summit and over 700 people came. So this is part of the movement, is really thinking about how we make those bridges and those connections between high school and college and what's beyond. And we've taken that model again from what used to be a very elite model, and we have made it possible for what's primarily for first generation college goers, and seen, again, very statistically very impressive results from that. What I just mentioned, the New England Lab. So there are, I don't know how many, excuse me, official schools at this point, but there are sites, schools, districts, absolutely regular districts who have taken this on as their mission and are really trying to figure out what this looks like all across New England with the support of many, many partners. Connecticut, we've worked most closely with most recently. They have an entire task force around personalization and competency ed. They're embracing this whole framework and starting to figure out with districts all across the state how might they support each other and this work. The Innovative Lab Network of States. So at the state level, There's a group of 12 to 13 states that have all agreed to principles that look essentially like that diagram that I showed you of those 4 student-centered tenets. And at the state level, they have said, we are going to take this as our philosophy at the state, and we are then going to figure out how to support districts to do this, what testing would look like in our state if we truly believe in this. And some of them have, in particular, New Hampshire, have gotten some pretty different waivers from the federal government in order to be enabled to do this. And Generation All. So it might be a little too soon to tell, but again, the philosophy behind what is happening here really does seem to embody all of those principles they were talking about, and is really trying to chart that course, at least for the neighborhood schools in Chicago. So what I take this little equation to mean, personally, is that we should be education optimists. This is not flavor of the month. This is not close my door and wait for it to go away. Things are going to change, and so we might as well take what we know about what works and what gets students excited and what keeps them engaged, and we might as well take more of an optimistic look that we are certainly going to be better off than we were hopefully 10 years ago, and maybe we'll actually finally get it right this time. So thank you so much. And where did my questions go? Uh-oh. Where'd the questions go? Well, I can remember them. So what we wanted to do, is that right? Or do you want to tell them?
No, I just want to say thank you.
Oh,
and we're
sure.
going to have some table talk and then open it up for Q&A.
So before diving in, just with it all being at me again, so one thing, so I had us do that very quick do now. So in the interest of sort of transparency and scaffolding, that's a technique many of you probably know. It's a good way usually to get students to settle down and get into the lesson pretty quickly. So a lot of teachers use that consistently in their classroom. It's the first 5 minutes of every class, so they expect that. And it was a way to hopefully get you to think a little bit about personally, what does this work mean for you? All trying to slightly in a lecture format model a little bit of what it would mean to be learner-centered with you as the learners. So also we wanted before, again, all the questions to just be kind of at me, we wanted to give you a chance to chew on a little bit because I know this is a lot of information in a really hot room at the end of a long day. So if you wouldn't mind turning to the folks at your table and just basically want you to chew on a couple of things. So what about this seems exciting to you or seems right on or reinforces something that you've already been doing? What about this do you think is going to be the most challenging? Whatever the this is, whether that's the how do I apply this tomorrow, whether it's the how do we do this whole thing. And then the third thing is that we're going to start at least for the sake of time, one question per table. So the questions don't have to be for me. They can certainly be for, well, what are you going to do about this? So something that's an aha or an excitement, something that's really you're feeling like is a challenge, and then what question as a table would you like to pose to me or the group?
So would you like to share your aha moment, or do you have a question?
I'm the challenge I would say is that I followed the Twitter feed, and out of the 40 people here, I think there may be 3 or 4.
Okay.
And so the challenge is, how do we motivate the people who are in these conversations to go beyond face-to-face and into the internet, where we can connect with each other, these ideas more consistently?
Okay, that's a good one. So think about how do we motivate people to participate in that conversation. That's great. How about a moment that resonated or an idea, a concept that was more of an aha or that affirms the work that you already do?
Well, in looking at this diagram for me, like in my experience with competency-based learning, personalized learning, and student-owned learning, it doesn't seem so daunting because those 3 really go together. Mm-hmm. Like I think once you start doing competency-based learning, if you're doing it in a real way, kids feel more like they can advocate for their own learning and the direction of their learning, and it suddenly becomes more personalized. Right. So that part seemed kind of like, oh yeah, those fit. Then they're, I think, not that it's just hanging out here anytime else or anytime, anywhere learning. But that it's kind of another animal, right? That I think schools struggle with, partnerships and getting our kids to all these other learning opportunities.
Right, right.
Are there any other challenges or questions that came up? Or a concept that was different or that you think would be challenging to take on?
One of the challenges that I encounter is the time. I have 100 kids, 5 classes a day, 50 minutes in time. And I think I teach science, so I would absolutely be in heaven if I could do this all the time. But it's the time, because each child needs time, individual time. You get to know them and to get to find out what would help them help themselves. And I don't know how to get around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? That issue of time? I mean, that's absolutely one of the biggest things that we hear that is difficult about starting to do something more along the lines of what I was talking about. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Or you had a different thought? No. Yeah.
No, I was just saying that one is like the total amount of time, but I think the big part, as you pointed to, is how time is divided up.
Right.
So instead of 50 minutes a day, you go 50 minutes is a lot. So being able to kind of step back and think, how can the school, because it's probably not an individual.
Yeah, it's out of my hands.
School, not discretion.
Right. I mean, in the ideal setting, you have a cadre of peers that think similarly. You have a really, student-centered, teacher-centered principal who says, you know what, you're right, and let's look at the schedule and start figuring out where there's some flexibilities, or let's throw it out altogether and figure out what works. I have a feeling that doesn't necessarily exist in most buildings, but that's again where I was trying to say that there are still things you can do along the way. There are like-minded teachers who would be willing to think about how to do a double block schedule with you, even if you can't redo the entire schedule. There are ways within that classroom to scaffold one more project that you can kind of work in with all of the other restrictions. I mean, time is a really, really big barrier to this. So it's in part thinking about that longer term game of, if time is one of the main things that we need to change and play with, what does that take? And in the interim, what are some plays within my existing structures and within my existing challenges that I can start to play with that? And that's one, for me, often one of the most exciting things is folks who aren't in systems that completely allow a competency-based, progression, and are in systems, but it's amazing when you start pushing on some of those levers, how much flexibility you find you do have. I mean, it's that whole, we are really taught in schools to think about all the barriers. We're not taught to think about creative ways around them, which is a much longer conversation. I'm happy to have over a glass of wine at some point with somebody. But sorry, and I'm totally taking over this. Yeah.
The immediate thing is like the example you talked about from the physics classroom. Within the time that we have structuring experiences for kids where they're working together, is a way to help them to help each other learn. And I think we don't think of our students as, resources, thank you, often enough, but sometimes I think that helps the teacher, if kids are helping each other, just put a problem for them and they're figuring it out together, it's not a burden on you or all 30 of them to understand what he or she knows, but they work on it together, then they can self-assess or peer assess so that they become more of a part of that process and a help to you in that way.
That might be a good idea for me to keep in the back of my head as I go through my day to try to incorporate that. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of the time is wasted because students are not that interested. You're battling time because you're trying to get them to do what you want them to do. So the challenge we have is how do we make classes more autonomy supporting so that students actually are intrinsically motivated, and that's what the research tells us. If you want intrinsic motivation to learn, right, you need to get them to feel like autonomy, right? And so how do we do that? And you know, there's ways of doing that, and that's one of them, right? Even the way we relate to students, you know, giving choices, which we do, right? We learn that after a while. You don't just give one, do this, but give two things, right? I mean, there's ways of doing that. But yeah, conversations we have are so important.
I'd like to give us a chance to go to the table questions. Did everyone get a chance to agree on one question?
Well, I just think there's one of the challenges is a structural barrier, the desire of a large district like Chicago to have consistency so that we can compare school A to school X is a barrier to the kind of experimentation and creativity that individual schools need to engage in to figure out ways of doing assessment or grading differently so that it's not an all or none, I passed algebra or I didn't, or creativity in scheduling, right? Like we also have the work rules issue of being in a large district. So for the district to think about how to make space for that kind of experimentation beyond just go start a charter school. But here in our district schools, how does that happen?
And you know, I'm sorry, I can't help, but just being, you know, from a neighborhood high school perspective, and if you think about your neighborhood high school or the ones that are near you, these are some of the schools. You know, there's different types of neighborhood schools, but some of them have had more challenges over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So when I think about people going to block schedules or standards-based grading, or, you know, when you're doing that in an environment that already is not, I don't know if stable's the best word or not, but it can, I mean, I can think of colleagues who tried to switch to a block schedule, but maybe they didn't have the teacher capacity to do it right then because, you know, all their teachers are new or they're not really bought in. Or, and so it's a really challenge because you're talking about like building the things as, and so what are some of the core things that any school needs to begin to think about experimenting? And in my experience, you've got to begin to think about the teacher community. You know, and so I can even say, just working with the teachers that I work with for 3 years, I'm so much more flexible in terms of going with teachers' ideas now than I would have been my first year, and it's so much easier to support. But you know, if you're a brand new teacher, you know, I don't really think you should be, you know, just trying every revolutionary thing in the world if you don't have some basic foundation pieces. And same thing for a school. If kids are still in the hallway, they're not even in classes, going to a block schedule, probably not the best idea.
So raise your hand at your table if you did agree on one question. I'd like to see if anyone has that question. Okay. Then let's just open the floor for a few questions. We have a few minutes. So if you have questions, just raise your hand right here to choose if you want
I have a question here.
Could you also just introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Michael Levesque. I'm Executive Director for a not-for-profit called Leap Learning Systems. Thank you for the presentation. And I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about New Haven. And I think the structural pieces are certainly a starting point, but the parent piece, in that parents are obviously conditioned to be in step with the traditional educational models, and they want to track and they want to make sure that their kids are moving through the K-12 system so that they emerge on the other side so they can do post-secondary work. The kind of parent buy-in and or pushback that district experienced, if you could just share a little bit of that, I'm interested to hear.
Yes, so that, I mean, it's a really important question, and it's part of what I was alluding to when I said the idea of go slow to go fast, is that one, when you sort of talk to districts that feel like they stumbled in trying to do this, or they didn't go as fast eventually as they wanted, one of the number one things they say, a lesson learned was not communicating enough in the beginning, particularly with parents and particularly with teachers. So that is absolutely part of it. New Haven is a little bit of a different situation because they are so New Haven is somewhere in between kind of the Hartford, if you know it, the sort of all portfolio model, and Chicago, which is kind of several different kinds of portfolio model, and New Haven's somewhere in between those. So that particular high school is one of, I mean, it's a pretty large city, so, and I don't know how many, but their whole name is the high school in the community, and they've always been about, so from their founding, they've always been this sort of alternative structure in that, again, they're teacher run, teachers make all the decisions, there's not an official administrator, the teachers elect a head of school, so they're a little bit different in that way, but that was just one example I like because they are dealing with such a difficult population and really struggling through it and thinking about it. We've seen this in many different places, and again, back to the original question about parents, is the theme has always been really asking them the questions of what do you want for your student and peeling that apart, because most of them will say college. Well, why do you want them to go to college? Because I want them to get a good job. Well, what is that? You know, so it's part of having those conversations and having the space to have those conversations has been really critical, because that enables people trying to enact these reforms to say, well, I'm having the same goals, and let me show you a couple of data points that's going to show you if we keep doing things the way we've been doing it, we are going to be doing a disservice to your student. One other little thing that you didn't specifically ask about, but I think was implicit, is some of these competency-based models. There was a real fear when this work started happening, particularly around the competency-based models, that if you sort of go to these, wacky transcripts where it's all about different competencies, it's not about you get an A in math, I'm not going to have a valedictorian, what on earth are colleges going to think? Implicit in that is a certain amount of classism, because really that question is only coming from the parents who envision their children going to some of the most elite four-year colleges, because other parents recognize that there is going to be some different transcripts of students are trying to get into post-secondary education, and what we have found is that that's actually a red herring. That is one of those things that turns out to not be an issue, at least, again, in New England, where I know the work best, where we have had all of the public colleges, all of the public community colleges, I think it's up to something like 50 right now, post-secondary institutions of all levels and all ilk sign an endorsement of a competency-based transcript, because what they care about is knowing who those incoming students are. They don't care about whether you're valedictorian in the class. They want to understand, are you going to do well at our institution? Do you fit well at our institution? And they're used to getting all sorts of wacky transcripts from homeschool, from international students, from charter schools, from tiny little districts in Alaska. So it's much less of an issue at that level than we thought originally 4 years ago or so this was going to be. So.
How big is that, the school you're describing?
The New Haven school? I don't remember offhand, but it's about the size of sort of a charter school. So they're small. If the implication of that is, can this only be done at small schools? That's certainly where it seems to be working better. But there are, again, statewide efforts and there are district-wide efforts that are starting to do it. I have not seen, and correct me others who know this more, I've not seen any large urban districts try to take it on as an entire thing. We've seen a lot more of the sort of medium size, so the Wallingfords and Meridans in Connecticut, parts of districts.
What's the medium size?
Wallingford, I believe, is around 20 to 30,000 total students. A fair amount of the places that we've seen go farthest are smaller, and that's part of what the research is starting to unpack. We know that the research on small schools is strong, and so that's a little bit conflated with it, is that if you move to a smaller school where students are known better, where it's more personalized, you're going to get better results. But in particular, the AIR study did a pretty rigorous comparison so that their data gave us some of the ability to say it's not just about a small schools effect, it's about an effect of the deeper learning and the student-centered work that's happening in that building. So it's where, I said in the beginning, we know a lot, we don't know everything. We know this is beneficial. We have great concerns, and when I say we, I mean in particular our organization because of the populations that we focus on, but there is, and I think many of us else there who work in this field, about what really starts to happen when we go to scale. Does this increase achievement gaps? We have reason to believe it works very, very well for underserved students. We've seen that in a lot of places, but it's again that question of when you start doing it at scale, what happens? There's no reason to think it's going to be any worse than what we've got right now, though.
We need to take one more question.
One more question? Peggy? Was that a hand or just a hair adjustment? No, hair adjustment? Anybody else? I guess you're it. What is this? Bring us home.
So, what policies in state level are our greatest barriers to getting this kind of flexibility into schools? The one I brought up here is the Carnegie Union policy. Are you seeing any states that are already policies that could help, if we change them, could help to free up this greater flexible space for teaching and learning? And I think about what have we learned from nations that don't have those policies? What are they doing in secondary levels of education that might be getting closer to this kind of highly sort of personalized approaches, but that still have standards?
So I think the Carnegie Unit one is less of an issue than we think. I think that's one of those places that if I remember the numbers correctly, there are 37 states right now that already allow some kind of flexibility around the Carnegie Unit, but we don't make use of it. So I actually think in some ways the issue is less about the policy and more about the cultural perceptions of what it means to do school and what it means to evaluate teachers and what it means to evaluate students. So that's one thing, is that I think what we're finding in this work is some of the things that we thought were existing barriers are more in cultural perceptions, which are huge barriers, but not necessarily policy issues. The other two places that I think are some of the biggest policy levers to change is around accountability and assessment. And that's where a lot of work is being done. Again, I sort of mentioned the deeper learning work by the Hewlett Foundation. I mean, they are working with a lot of partners around the country to really figure out if we truly want those sort of 6 deeper learning elements, how do we assess them and which parts of that should be part of a student-centered accountability system. And that was also inherent in some of what I was saying where change is coming. I mean, right now, literally, I mean, we have folks from the Deeper Learning Network, from some of our researchers that we've worked with, from JFF, who are preparing testimony to present to Congress on the 21st, where there's hearings about ESEA. So the change is coming, and there are some opening windows right now to think about how do we hold rigorous high standards, how do we test for those in ways that honor learning, that truly tell us something about learning, and how do we do it in a way that expands and makes assessment more of a part of how we learn rather than just a testing of learning. And then the last piece where I think is more of some ways a little P policy is around how we prepare and support and hire teachers. So none of these changes are ever really going to take root if we don't change at a state level how we honor teachers, how we pay teachers, what it means to be a teacher, which again are the cultural pieces, and then really thinking about how do we train them? What are we preparing them for? Are we preparing teachers to be teachers of classrooms of the future? And I would say largely right now we are not. We are asking them to get into these schools and relearn what it means to actually teach for learning. Is that one more question? Or
Well, before parent accountability, but what goes on at home or after school has a big conflict on how a student may learn when they come to school. Because like some youth don't know how to handle those emotions or be social like that to balance out the situation. Sometimes coming to school may just be that person getting away from something that's worse. How is that? How could it be a system to engage that? Because I feel like a lot of youth in public or urban schools have that issue where they're dealing with something internally, and that's not being helped with in any case. And that because they can't be social, they don't know how to communicate. Then they hold it in, and that be your class clown, or that be the kid that doesn't do anything or just comes in class and sleeps and eats at lunch. Like he gets left behind and he gets assessed. He takes a bad assessment because he's emotionally and socially challenged. Distracted. Yes.
So that social emotional piece that you bring up is critical, and it is absolutely fundamental to whether or not this meaning this sort of big vision is going to work at scale, is if we can address that. We don't have that particularly pulled out in that model, and you see it's one of the things that we addressed in the FAQ, because there is no way to do any of that successfully if you don't address the social and emotional factors of students. So it is throughout the whole piece, and it's something that you're welcome to sort of challenge us on, and we've wrestled with, is should we pull it out more as part of the actual model, or is it enough to say this is how you actually would do it in any kind of successful way? So, and just to reinforce, I mean, one of the reasons that we think that is so important is, again, the motivation research, the social engagement research, all of that talks about the fact that students will not be learning if you don't address the fact that they're hungry, the fact that they don't feel safe, and the fact that they don't have a good place to study when they go home. So we know that is absolutely fundamental to the success of any of this. And it's, again, when we start looking at more of a scale effort, how do we ensure that we keep that individual piece on the students so that they are meeting those needs as well as their academic needs? Thank you. I probably used up more time.
Are there any closing comments or another question before we wrap it up? And I would just like to thank Rebecca. Thank you for joining us tonight.